I had a head start in general with music because my mother, whose father was a fiddler, but I didn't know that until my late 40s, and she was a violinist. She wanted to play like her uncle Anton, who had learned violin and was apparently quite good. And she grew up in a small farm in north central Kansas, and Dad grew up mostly in Nebraska, around the Hastings area, Hartwell, and he loved music too. He never had a chance to play or really anything but harmonica because they didn't have the money for a piano, I think. But his mother had played violin, and his aunt had played piano with her, classical. So I think genetically the deck was stacked that I was going to be, both my brother and I are musicians. And how it was that I found myself so enamored of folk music is partly because my father was very, very interested in it. And he loved all sorts of music. So I grew up with things like, music of Shakespeare's time and medieval English lyrics, and I just loved those too. And I wanted to play the lute so badly, and I never did get one, but I can play the guitar in lute tuning from tablature.
Wow.
So yeah, I did learn that. I took guitar lessons up at Washington U in order primarily to do that. And that style is not miles away from folk song either. So I think there are certain maybe melodic qualities that have always attracted me to traditional music. A lot of folk songs or traditional songs are in what we call modes, which are just the scales that fall outside the regular major and minor keys. And I just have always been drawn to them. So when, Dad used to have, when I was very small, was born in 1955. So the very earliest records Dad would have had of folk music would have been something like Burl Ives, things like that. The Fox Went Out on a Winter's Night. He used to sing me that, I remember. And then he got interested in Peter, Paul, and Mary, and he bought their records. And he took me when I was 8 years old to a McDonald Arena, and we had to sit behind them because it was just, they were facing one way, and they turned around and apologized at one point. I was so thrilled. But I was just nuts about them. But then a couple of years later, Dad was big on mail order records. And music and books were his life. And to a large extent, music and art and books were my mother's life. And a lot of the art prints you see in this room were chosen by my mother, who had no even art appreciation classes. But this is just the sense of wanting beauty in your life that I grew up with. So the folk box came out, I don't know, 64, 65, and so it featured like ultra traditional people like Clarence Ashley, the singer and banjo player from Kentucky, singing the classic Cuckoo Bird, and as well as the Dillards Bluegrass Band, and Blind Lever Jefferson, and a couple of other blues artists, Leadbelly, of course, and then Gene Ritchie. And I just fell totally in love with Gene Ritchie. And I had to get a dulcimer. And when I was 15, my father bought me one. We mail ordered it from a guy named Homer C. Ledford out in Kentucky. But I'll get back to that because that's another story. But anyway, so it also had, more popular people like Judy Collins. And I liked it all, but I was just so drawn to the old haunting kind of ballads, and I just thought they were gorgeous. And Ewan McCall is on there too, and Dad started bringing home records of Ewan McCall and Burt Lloyd singing child ballads. That was my introduction to child ballads. And it's just like kind of my own private class in folk song. It just kind of accumulated. You just, you get surrounded by the materials, and there were lots of notes in those Ewan McCall Lloyd albums, and I just ate them up. It was all fascinating to me, and I would go around. I don't know what other kids did in their lunch hours in high school, but I went around memorizing 30-verse Scots ballads or English ballads or whatever, and then later Ozarks things. And the way I found out about more Ozarks material, I had heard about Vance Randolph, but when I was 15 or 16, there were a couple of years we had a folk festival over at the now MSU campus. Then it was SMS. It wasn't even SMSU. And 1970, thereabouts. And my friends Dick and Ann Albin, Ann is now Ann McPhee. She lives in Kentucky, and she's a wonderful singer too. She had a big influence on me, I would say. She sang a lot of those old Kentucky ballads, but she had Arkansas roots, so as well as New Mexico. So she had kind of a real interesting background, and she played dulcimer too. So they did this somehow. Dick's father, Edgar Albin, who taught art here at SMS, he somehow wangled some money out of the administration to put on this folk festival. And I was, happy as a pig in whatever. So I just went around from stage to stage. I had my little program, and I followed Danielle Fraley, the Fraley family from Eastern Kentucky. Carter Caves was there, and I was just totally entranced. And I went around, and I remember I did not have a tape recorder. I went from stage to stage following Danielle around, and she only did the same 2 or 3 songs. So I wrote down the words while she sang, and I memorized the melody, because I'm pretty good at that. It just, And then she's the one I asked, where should I get a dulcimer? She told me, Homer C. Ledford. So I kind of have an unusual dulcimer. It needs some repairs right now, but it's, so then I got that, and I taught myself that out of the Gene Ritchie dulcimer book. And I taught myself guitar when I was 12 going on 13. My mother was in the hospital for quite a long time, and I used to call it was before music therapy was around as a classification. I just called it my occupational therapy. So I taught myself guitar out of a book that I still find very useful, and I've used it with some beginning guitar students. So so I already had the guitar, but the dulcimer was just, different, because it had that modal quality built into it. Just, it was there. And I started to do songs with the dulcimer where I was using it not to double my voice, but to play a harmony to it, because that's what Gene Ritchie and that's what Barbara Edwards, who was also at the festival, did, and Almeda Riddle sang. And I don't know where I got the chutzpah to go up to Dick Albin at the age of 15 or whatever I was and say, can I do a spot? And I don't know whether I did 2 or 3 songs. I did at least 2, because I sang, I think it was either Lord Randall or it was Edward, but it was one of these classic Scots ballads. Probably Lord Randall. And then I also did Nottingham in Town with a guitar, because I didn't have a dulcimer yet. And that's when Barbara Edwards came up and said, do you like Gene Ritchie? I said, I love Gene. Many, many years later, I was very honored to introduce her to a show she was doing up at South Bend, Indiana, where I was living when I got my PhD. Anyway, so that was thrilling. And so that whole thing was such a turning point. Max Hunter was at the festival, and I went to both of his lectures, And I'll never forget how tickled I was, because I did think it was very humorous, when he described the oral tradition as my mouth to your ear.
Guess that's an interesting way of putting it.
It is, but I have a dirty mind. You can edit that out. But anyway, so yeah, I found out that he had deposited cassette copies of all of his recordings, at least all of his song recordings. Your Aunt Judy Dominy and I have discussed other materials that we're not sure about their whereabouts, because we know he did a lot of fiddle tunes, but they're not in the collection that's online now, which was it Michael Murray put online. And those, it's just the songs. But it's great to have them up there, because I had to get I thought it was fabulous though, because I could just go to the library and check out a bunch of cassettes and bring them home and listen to them. And these were mostly older people, including people like Almeda Riddle and Ollie Gilbert, who were pretty famous. They'd been kind of discovered by the folk world, and Almeda sang all over the country.
Was that kind of the entry point where the Ozarks became more of a direct focus on influence on you? I
would say so, yeah, because like I said, we had some materials, but I didn't yet own the Vance Randolph collection. My dad bought me that sort of volume by volume, and he bought me the old Dover Child collection. But I would have heard here and there the song from the Ozarks, but we didn't have, I didn't have access to certainly field recordings like this. I mean, it was quite amazing, and it was similar enough to the Kentucky stuff that I could hear the kinship, and so they became my teachers, I think, and I just listened, and I set some of them to the dulcimer, and others I thought no, they should be unaccompanied, and I also learned things out of the Cecil Sharp collection. So I had a kind of a swath of the Southern Mountains repertoire at a fairly early age, and so yeah, that's what I would do in my lunch hours in high school.
Wow.
Learn all these songs, and it was great, because it really whiled away the time, and I felt like I wasn't wasting my half hour. I'd scarf down my lunch and then walk around and sing under my breath. So
I completely lost my train of thought there for a second. So I know what I was going to ask. With that influence of the Ozarks, music that was happening here, I mean, I know that Randolph did do some recordings, field recordings, but those ones presumably, like you said, weren't available at that point, and at least in a very accessible form. I mean, there just weren't those even resources available until the Hunter collection was available to the public, was there? I mean, you could hear...
Not really. I mean, you'd have to go down, you could have gone down to Batesville, Arkansas, and listened to John Quincy Wolfe's collection, probably on reel-to-reel. At least I imagine. His wife's still alive, I should ask her. But now that's digitized, it's on the internet. And then Randolph's wife, Mary Celeste Parler, her, I think most, if not all of her song collection is digitized. And it's available through the University of Arkansas.
Well, from what you know back then and now and everything, can you talk a little bit about the influence of Irish tradition on the songs or European tradition, and if there is anything, in your opinion, that really defines the Ozarks in forms of ballads?
Well, in terms of ballads, I wouldn't say necessarily, because the ballads in the Ozarks are very much like the ballads throughout the Southern Mountains and the country in general. You'll find ballads all over. Don't think there was a whole lot of impact, because the Irish did sing ballads, but that they were more, the repertoire over there, in Irish Gaelic and then later in English has often been more lyric than narrative. On the other hand, having said that, I was thinking of child ballads, a lot of the broadside ballads, what Hugh Shields calls the new ballads, which would have come in the 16th century. There were a lot of those in Ireland, and I did a great deal of research on them when I was writing my book on Irish song. So yeah, there are quite a few ballads in the Ozarks, in the repertoires of Ozarks singers, from those kinds of ballads, from the broadside ballads. Things like Jackie Frazier, for example, which is extremely popular almost everywhere, but there are several versions of it just in the Max Hunter collection. And so yeah, the hugest influence, I think, from Ireland on the Ozarks would have been on these broadside ballads, which are, to be distinguished from we call them the older ballads or the child ballads, and then there's this whole big kind of quarrel about whether they were originally oral and, just fashioned by the people, or they spontaneously generated by a singing, dancing throng, like something out of Wicker Man, I don't know. Anyway, but so there are all these theories, but they were there, and it's a style, definite style, and there are 2 or 3 different kinds of melodies that are used and sort of stanzas, and then when you get to the broadside ballads, there are different kinds of stanzas, and the lines are longer, and so we know these things that distinguish them. And the later ones also tend to be more repertorial, you are there, kind of like, in the town of, for example, there's a very famous ballad called, in England it's known as the Oxford Girl, and in Ireland it's the Wexford Girl, and over here there are versions called the Lexington Girl, and the one I sing is called the Waxwell Girl. It's from Arkansas, and it's very much the same story. But one of the things that I think a lot of singers enjoy about all of these different songs, whether they are lyric or whether they are narrative, like what we call ballads, what folklorists call ballads, is the little variations, and like in this version of the Waxwell Girl, and it's this story about this guy who's getting married, and it's sort of like Pretty Polly, if you're familiar with that, but where he goes out and kills her and digs a grave and throws a little dirt over her, and it's kind of short. But then the Waxwell Girl, or the Oxford, or the Export, or whatever, it's a more drawn out story, and it talks about where he had his mill, where he was born, all of that kind of thing, like these details that you don't get in the child ballads so much. They're sort of more primal, if you will, or at least they have that kind of feeling. They're very dramatic. And so he takes her out, he decides they're going to get married, but they leave the house of the mother to take a walk down by the riverside. And anyway, he picks up a gambrel stick and knocks the poor girl down. And that's pretty common, although gambrel stick, I think that's the only version I know that has a gambrel stick. And I had to look up gambrel. It's like something you put in a roof. Anyway, yeah, it's fun. Yeah, you can learn all kinds of things from these songs. And but my favorite thing is it's also a good night ballad, which is supposedly a ballad that was written on the eve of someone's execution, a criminal's execution, and they've written this thing, and it's a warning to people not to do as they have done. And of course, they didn't write it at all. Somebody just found out, oh, such as this hanging is going to happen, this and this such and such crime. Let's write a ballad and sell it on at the execution, which was always kind of a, you know, it was a social event, as grisly as we think that is nowadays. But they would all, the songs would figure in those events. And so anyway, in this particular version of the ballad, when he gets to the part where he's warning people, come all you young people, a warning take by me, don't murder your true lover, it'll be a cruelty. But it's the next one that I think is kind of funny. It'll bother you, until the day you die, and then they will hang you while on a scaffold high.
Oh, wow.
It'll bother you. Just a little. Fare you well, my pretty little miss, so fare you well a while. I'm going away 10,000 miles from home. Oh, who will shoe your pretty little feet, and who will glove your hair, and who will kiss your ruby, ruby lips when I'm in a foreign land? Papa will shoe my pretty little feet, Mama will glove my hair. Nobody will kiss my ruby, ruby lips when you're in a foreign land. And who will comb your yellow, yellow hair with a new-made red comb? And who will love your pretty little babe till I'm a-comin' home? I had a feeling in my breast like I never felt before. I went on board with Johnson's men, and I left my native shore. One of the great things, and this ties in with your question about Irish influence, which was huge for me, and it's kind of like my not split personality, but my dual interest in Irish traditional song and British, but American and Southern Appalachian and Ozarks. This woman, Bertha Lauderdale, that Max found, also Mary Celestial Parlor, Vance's wife, recorded her. So there are several of her songs online through that, as well as through the Max Hunter collection. And I just, kind of fell in love with her and learned a song called Adieu My Lovely Nancy. And it is so Irish that when I was at the age of 22 and doing my first field collecting in Ireland, and I was having her sing for me, and then she asked me if I'd sing for her, or maybe I volunteered, and I did that song. The next time I came, and she was blind, she went into her bedroom and came back with a little Tandy tape recorder. That's like a realistic tape recorder, same brand, Radio Shack. And she put it on the table and said, "Sing Nancy for me."
Oh.
And what an honor,
Yeah.
you know? So, in other words, she recognized the Irishness of it. And so for me to bring something back across the ocean to her, but I found out later that was something that had happened a lot with people who'd emigrated, especially to Canada, and brought back songs like The Lonesome Scenes of Winter. It's very common in the United States, especially very much in Canada as well. And people came back to Ireland and they had these songs. So you'll find things like The Lily of the West, which we think of as an American song, and that kind of thing. Other stuff that got into the repertoire over there, the Irish love Stephen Foster songs. Those were very, very common. So there's kind of this concept that you have to find these terribly isolated places to find the purest folklore. And it's kind of, not a myth, it's a misconception. It's a misconception because there is no such place. Relatively speaking, yeah, the Ozarks, especially before the most modern era, were pretty far back.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't mean that nothing ever came through. Or, I mean, how did Bertha Lauderdale's family end up there? Her grandfather was brought as a child, but I don't know any more than that how they ended up in Fayetteville or in that area. It's amazing. So, you know, we do know about the Irish wilderness actually having settlers from Ireland, but most of the Irish in the Ozarks are the so-called Scotch Irish. So it's pretty fascinating. But also they're just, you know, you find all these gems of songs and then you find out about the singers. And that was something that I loved. I mean, I don't know how I got, again, the chutzpah to do this, but when I was college was great. I went to Wash U, heard lots of great stuff. And when my year abroad, I got over to Ireland and was immersed in some great stuff over there. Got to hear Ballads concert and the Willie Clancy Folk Week, which happens every July. I gave a couple of lectures there in the 90s, which was such a thrill, because I went there in 76 the first time as a 20-year-old, wide-eyed thing. And but the following year, my dad had gotten this little brochure about this program to learn Irish language and folklore in County Donegal. So I took my meager savings, and Dad gave me a few hundred from. He said it's a late graduation gift, and I went over there and I started hearing some singing, and the teacher brought in this wonderful traditional singer, Annie Owen Amen. It's sort of like in Russian. You have a person's first name and then the first name of one of their parents. And so Annie, daughter of Owen, son of Amen, and Annie Nigalaher. And I talked to her a little bit. But the whole thing I was just fascinated. So I was down in Dublin afterwards, and I ran into this guy named Alan Feldman, who was an American folklorist, and he was doing stuff on Irish fiddle in Donegal. He said, "Why don't you apply for a youth grant?" I'm like, "What's that?" Anyway, I found out, and I was very silly. I thought that if I could keep the grant down to the smallest amount of money, that I would be more likely to get it. I don't know where that came from. Probably growing up with Depression-era parents. I don't know. Anyway, it was kind of a dumb thing to do in retrospect, but I lived to tell the tale. I wanted to rent a car. I ended up renting a bicycle.
Oh.
So it was, but and my Irish was still not very good. But they could tell, the singers could tell that I had real interest. And some of them were elderly, in their 80s, that kind of thing. And they were, like two of them especially, Nellie O'Donnell and her cousin, Eva Devaney, Hudi Fetty Hudi. Yeah. And I just fell in love with them, and they were kind of like the grandparents I never had. So I don't know. I don't think you can be interested in all this stuff and not do it from the heart. I don't think you can just be. There probably are a few who do it out of just intellectual curiosity, and I do have a lot of that. And I can get lost in that kind of stuff too. But to me, the head and the heart go together. So I was there trying to be a folklorist and having no training whatsoever, 22. But people who were transcribing, then I went a couple of years later to do a master's degree in folklore out in North Carolina in Chapel Hill at UNC. And one of my friends, they said, oh, could you bring your originals back and we'll dub them here? And I said, oh, fine. And this one of my friends in the folklore department who was dubbing them said, you're really good with them. And I said, oh, I just can't stand to hear my voice. And same way I'm with you. And he said, no, you're really getting some great answers out of these people. I mean, they're opening up to you. And I was asking them about the songs and the stories attached to them, but I also asked about their lives around songs and how they got interested. And Nellie went off into this rapturous a little soliloquy one time about how I loved songs. I love songs, and if I heard a good song, I would be in my bed going over that song at night. Oh, I loved songs. I just melting, and I was desperately trying to learn the language. That took quite a bit longer, unfortunately, because I wasn't able to stay in part of the. Even then, the language was starting to kind of melt away, and but Ranifest, where I was doing work with Nellie and Hudi and a couple of other people, that was a very, very, was thought of as a pure well of the language. And Annabry, which is where I ended up staying for reasons I won't go into. Some of them were practical that I didn't expect. And that was a what they call a Brach-Gaeltacht area, which was Brach meaning speckled. So the language was kind of spotty, and some of the people I stayed with didn't even speak it. So I don't know, I kept on struggling. So there I was at University of North Carolina, and there was one of the world's leading Irish scholars. And so I took everything. I even took Middle Welsh from him just because he was teaching it. I mean, not like I've ever used it. Oh well, but I can pronounce things like Llantrysant and Llandrydod and stuff like that. But anyway, so I think that being over there, however, and I also was playing in music sessions. Sometimes the music sessions included singing, but they were starting to get separate over there, which was, when they were beginning to have more sessions that were oriented towards singers, and other sessions were just playing reels at the sound of light. And and that was an unfortunate trend, and it wasn't universal. There were still places where if somebody was asked to sing a song, there'd bit of hush, and people would shut up. And but when I started to go to the music parties here in the late 80s, early 90s, it's like it's the same thing. This is the same thing as when I've gone to house parties at people's houses in Ireland where they had musicians, and maybe somebody would get up and dance, and they might be a story. I don't know if you ever heard Doug, I can't think of his last name, the storyteller from Taney County, Forsyth.
Yeah, is it Doug Mankey?
Doug Mankey, thank you. Yeah. I unfortunately, when I taped him, he wanted me to come to his office, and it was so echoey that the tape it's not entirely, unintelligible, but it's close to it. But he used to come to McClurg and tell stories, and that what folklorists would call personal narrative stories. They weren't, once a time there was a king in Ireland or something like that. It was, or it wasn't even jack tales, or some of the ones that Vance Randolph collected. I got and then I skipped over. No, I didn't skip over it. Haven't come to it yet. So then all of this was starting to mush in my mind. Before I even went to get my degree, I had a chance to do residencies in several schools in the early 80s in Missouri. One here at Eugene Field and two up in the Kansas City area. And I've looked back on it thinking I was going to be embarrassed at the way I set it up, and no, I would probably do most of these things the same way. And I did a lot of research. I learned some of the Vance Randolph stories. This is all free association. That's why I'm kind of doing it this way. So I learned some stories like that. And then we had a day, because I knew about children's folklore, because Dad was interested in that, and he used to bring home books about it when I was in high school. So I'd say, okay, this is your own folklore, and I would have them do songs and jump rope rhymes and jokes and everything. And I heard some really funny stuff that I had never heard, like "Joy to the World, the School's Burned Down."
Oh.
Is that familiar?
I haven't heard that one.
And all the teachers too. Oh, where is the principal? He's hanging on the flagpole with a rope around his neck.
Oh, jeez.
It was kind of like in say medieval times, when they would have a festival of fools where the tables would be turned and the peasants could just say whatever they wanted to and sing whatever they wanted, like that. It was kind of like that, because the teachers were in the classroom, but because I was saying, I want to hear your songs, they were emboldened, and they were telling me Michael Jackson jokes were big, that kind of thing. But there were also things that I recognized, say my playmate, that kind of thing, and pat a cake stuff. So, and then I taught them dances one day, and did the whole 9 yards. But the majority, I'd say, was singing. But I did bring all the instruments, and I hold up the dulcimer, like, can anybody tell me what this is called? My hand would go up. A saxophone? Anyway, so I've done that kind of thing with folklore, in terms of trying to, again, in that case, pass it on, really. And some of the songs I did repeatedly, and things that, some of Almeda Riddle's children's songs, and then a couple of ballads from the Max Hunter collection that were short and memorable. And one of the teachers at one of the schools came in, they're singing your songs on the playground. Yeah. And then I went to North Carolina, and I did get more, I started to intellectualize more about things then, but it was all good. And then I ended up going to England and working in a rather strange archive. It was good. It was a good experience, but it was not something I would have ever expected. It was a radio producer's. It was basically the stuff that a radio producer from Birmingham, England, had left from his collection of tapes and everything else. He'd done work for the BBC, along with people like Peggy Seeger and Ewan McCall, and they did these things called the radio ballads. So that was like really kind of a big thing, but I didn't know anything about it. I was walking into it blind, and the first thing I see is this table just full of stuff that's totally uncatalogued, and they did have boxes, and the boxes had been cataloged, but they were totally random. Like one of them had lace curtains, and another one had flannel sheets. I'm like, I think we're going to pitch these. But there were lots of other things, and a lot of it was about I learned a lot about the British folk revival, and I decided that it was not something I ever wanted to write about or have much to do with, but there you go. And I got to play in folk clubs and at festivals, and that was pretty fabulous. And then I came back and started to do a PhD in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania, but the money situation wasn't looking good. I had 2 outpatient operations. It was all like, So I came back to here, the house I grew up in. And it's a Robert Frost poem with the line, home is that place that where you go, they have to take you in. but it worked both ways over the years and throughout the 90s. And but I did end up, at the end of the 90s, I decided that touring with folk music for a living was not likely to earn me a great living. So I decided I was going to go back to school. And the two choices were either to get certification here in French and English, or to get like a fellowship in Irish Studies somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I got the Irish Studies fellowship up at Notre Dame. And the first thing I asked before I even accepted the invitation was, can I do a dissertation about a folklore subject?
Mm.
And they said, yes, as long as it's connected to literature. So, and I had several friends who gave me ideas, and I took them and ran. And I do incorporate stuff from a lot of American folklore, and I can't remember which chapter it is. I really, I quote a lot from John Quincy Wolfe's article, which is online, which is just fabulous, where he talks about different kinds of singers. And this is something else that just bowled me over, because you start out thinking it's just songs, and it's about the singers, it's about the musicians, it's about the communities. It's, at the end of it all, it's community. And so I started writing along those lines. But I did use John Quincy Wolfe and some other materials from the Ozarks in that. And so it's always been like intertwined to me. And in the past year, we've had a lot of Zoom singing sessions throughout the country. And I usually pick one Irish song and one American song. And often the American songs are from the Ozarks.
Mm.
So that's why I say, dual personality. I've just got that interest.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the instrumental music.
Mm.
Because I play both old-time fiddle and traditional Irish fiddle.
Mm.
And I play the 5-string banjo. So to me, it all just goes together.
Mm-hmm.
But any musician you talk to will say it's the people that make it what it is. It's getting together, playing the music, and the music is like the bonding material. And there's so much in it. There's so much in the music as well. There's so many emotions, and you can get really high, especially if you're playing with a bunch of friends, or even people you've never met. That happened to me one night in Ireland, and some of the best players in the country were there, and it just doesn't get any better, And I was asked to sing, which was really nice. But see, that's the other thing, is that you're asked. There's an etiquette, and it's true here too. Although not as many people in even my generation are aware of it as they would have been previously, that it's something where you sort of sometimes have to coax people to sing. So I'm not sure what it must have been like to, well, I don't know, Max Hunter does talk about, trying to find ways of reciprocating, because they're giving him these songs, and what can he do in return? So he helped, was it Fred Hyde, to dislodge a hornet's nest, and various things like that, help get hay, and baled, and that kind of thing. So what I can do is sing and play for people. Although when I came back from Ireland, I did send gifts to a few of them, things I thought they would like, and then eventually I did make I was supposed to have something to show for the youth grant, by the way. So in the early 80s, I ended up putting together a radio show for what they called the Options series on NPR. And I've got several copies of it in cassette form. And it's just something I did. And used a friend of my brother's had a reel-to-reel and mixing board and everything, and I dubbed everything from cassette to reel-to-reel, and I learned how to fade and all this stuff.
Wow.
Well, it's really not that hard once you do it, and splice and all that kind of stuff. But that's old technology, and I'm not nearly as kind of up on the digital world as I need to be. But
Well,
anyway.
one thing you said that I was curious on your perspective about, obviously the music being the binding that, brings people together, and especially in community kind of is that central thing in some cases. In your opinion, given what you saw back then and what you're seeing now, how do you see this type of tradition evolving in the Ozarks, and are you concerned about what the future looks like?
Well, I am, but I would say that's true for all sorts of culture in the modern age or the contemporary era. It has been hard, and COVID, of course, was very hard on people because not being able to get together in close quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And there aren't enough younger people, I think. There are some fabulous, who I think of as younger, they're in their 30s, like Nathan McAllister, and Ashley, I can't remember what her married name is.
Forrest, isn't it?
You probably know better than
Ashley Hull, yeah.
Yeah, but originally she was Hull.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anyway. And they're really fabulous players, and Nathan is also very interested in the cultural aspect
Mm-hmm.
of it, and then there are a lot of people my vintage who are very it's our life basically. You can get obsessive about it, but and then also it does help you get by. It helps cheer you up. But it's hard. Like, it's hard for me to play my fiddle much when I don't have a dance coming up. There's nothing to practice for, and and I do like the dances quite a bit. Way back in the 90s, I got to play at one or two of the square dances in Taney Center, and those were fast. Those were real fast. But I'd be playing banjo along with Bob. My hand's going to fall. But then we have the contra dances here, and it's a chance to get together with my musician friends as well as the dance community, and you get to know them over time too, and that's been really hard on them because they're not. It's been a struggle for them too, even though that's sort of a revival thing, rather than like the old square dances were a little bit more kind of organic, if you will. But it's been a struggle to get younger people involved, even though they did have a fair number of like homeschoolers and stuff who got interested and started to come out. But I don't know what it'll look like once when we get this under control. Yeah. And I don't. And it's with the music itself. Without the dancers, it's harder to keep it going too, I think. I think David says the same thing, but I think the musicians will keep finding each other, but they're just, again, it's all kind of all goes together, and I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say I'm terribly optimistic, but I can't really predict. Singing, that's even more of a minority interest. And there have been some people out east, like Elizabeth Laprelle and Sam Gleaves. Well, Sam Gleaves is from Kentucky, I think. No, he's from Virginia originally. He went to Berea. And they've really immersed themselves, and they sound like the real deal. but they've gone the professional route. They do make music with their families, and in Elizabeth's case, she sings with her mother. So there've been some Zoom concerts from all over the place, including from London and from Ireland, and they've brought in people, an international crowd, and sometimes they're too big, and it becomes sort of, we've got to get through all these people we have stacked up ready to sing, and you don't have that sense of interaction. I have a couple that I'm in, which are, they're much smaller, and a lot of the people know each other. One of them's in the Twin Cities. And last summer we met every week, and it really helped get me through, because I really was I was quite isolated. And so these have been an interesting kind of lifeline. And there are a few younger people who are getting interested, but not all of them are learning. Not all of them are what Hughie, getting back to County Donegal, said, it's all right for people to learn if they learn, they listen to a proper thing. In other words, stylistically finding the right sources. So, because, for example, I chose Jean Ritchie over Judy Collins, that kind of thing. And I'm not always seeing that much discrimination stylistically with some of the younger singers I've seen on the Zoom sessions. So it's hard to say. But as my friend John Molden, who's from Ireland, says, the fact that they're singing, that's the main thing. And so, I mean, he's looking at it in terms of community first and content second. Ideally, we'd like to have the two in the same kind of rank, but it's it has definitely been a lifeline for a lot of us who've been very isolated during this whole ordeal. And so technology coming to our rescue in kind of unforeseen ways. But of course, the real thing we always feel like is when we actually get together and make music and visit and eat. And that's what McClurg's always been about. And a lot of music parties over in Ireland were like that too. And they'd be at private houses instead of at the pub. And they'd be very much along those lines. And they might even have people playing cards.
Kind of like McClurg too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying. I started to write, if I could ever get myself to transcribe all these interviews I did and I did a lot of interviews specifically asking people about these community functions, and there are a lot of similarities. And I did a presentation a couple times comparing McClurg to Irish music, or they don't call them music parties, but sometimes they do. They use the word kosher, which means party. And there's a lot of similarity in terms of dance too. Like there's one part of Eastern Ulster where they actually, I don't know about now, but until recent times, they talked about square dances. And they were what the modern people would call set dances, which are still quite popular around Ireland, but they were almost died out. And they had to be revived, and a lot of people are absolutely just, addicted to them. Kind of the way you went to Taney Center, like every single dance, you have to do every single dance. I didn't, because I was, I didn't know the dances, and I was always afraid. But they usually throw you in the right direction if if you weren't doing the right, to the right partner or to the neighbor or something. Oh, you're, and, but it was, I do see a great deal of continuity in that respect, and just the whole sense of community and of and doing these, kinds of traditional activities.
Mm-hmm.
So le plus ça change, and I did find also, I was trying to get a grant and it never materialized, but a guy over at the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, he was very encouraging about the project, and he said, why don't you send me a list of surnames from the area where the music is, where the dances are, etc. And I went down to, I can't remember whether it was in Forsyth, I went to a couple of different county seats and looked at old censuses. And I did a sort of, not entirely random, I'd say, I tried to do a representative selection of names. And then I called Aline, and I went through this long list I had, and I'd say, which ones of these ring a bell? And so then I had this shorter list, and that's what I sent to Philip at the museum. And he said, this is incredible. Not only are these really common Ulster names, I can actually narrow this down to, a locality.
That's wild.
Isn't that?
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that they came from there, but it means that some kind of correspondence was there. Not that other cultures don't have very, very similar kinds of practices, because they do. I mean, they have music parties up in the northern Midwest, in Scandinavian country, basically, that are not unlike what we have. So I think there are just a lot of commonalities in general, but it's kind of fun to look at the Ulster. I don't like to kind of oversell that, because sometimes it gets to where people exaggerate the connections, but I think the connections are there. And a lot of it just does come back down to culture, to what we think of culture as, culture being cultivating. What are we cultivating? We're cultivating our humanity. Willie Moore was a king, his age 21, when he courted a damsel fair. Her eyes
dance while the